All right, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's a couple of minutes past. So welcome to our last event for spring 2026. This is a panel discussion on the Great Depression. My name is Sarah Reed, and I am here with my esteemed colleagues to talk about all things dealing with the Great Depression. Before we get started, I do have just a little bit of context, historical context for you about the Depression, just to kind of give you an idea of where it is, at least in history. So the Great Depression lasted from roughly 1929 to the start of World War II. It marked a period of deep economic decline, thousands of shuttered banks and businesses, and unemployment rates in the double digits. But the human toll the Depression took is no less important, and a subject some of our esteemed panelists are going to discuss today. So what began the Depression? And I'm not going to get too much in the weeds on this. I'll let some of my fellow colleagues talk about this. But there were many causes. For one, economic policies put into place in the 1920s that favored businesses encouraged investment in American companies. While those investments led to an increase in production, we do not necessarily see an equal increase in wages, leading to a lack of consumer spending power. There were also major American industries like cars and coal that employed thousands of people. When those companies were hard hit by depression, many lost their jobs, affecting not only the American economy, but leading to a dramatic increase in unemployment. There was also a bull market and a speculative fervor that gripped the nation. The idea of get rich quick led to risky investments in real estate and the stock market. For those who could not afford to invest in the market, they could buy on margin, taking out a loan for the stock and using the same stock as collateral for the loan. It is also important to keep in mind that the United States was part of a global economy. Depression did not just hit here, but in many places around the world, impacting business imports and exports. We like to trace the beginning of the Depression to the stock market crash on October 29th, 1929, or Black Tuesday. And while that was a major event that led many across the country to more fully understand the fragile nature of the United States economy, we were actually seeing a slowing of the economy a few years before, with production declining in many businesses and a slight uptick in the number of layoffs. But because of that bull market, very few people sensed troubles brewing. Indeed, speculation inflated stock and real estate prices, but when the market crashed, that facade too came tumbling down, leading to stock prices plummeting, dropping by 2/3 of their pre-crash values, and the real estate bubble bursting. When the latter occurred, homeowners were left in precarious positions, then owning homes whose values were worth far less than what they paid for them. Foreclosures rose significantly. Oh, wrong button. There we go. After the stock market crash, President Herbert Hoover assured the nation that the fundamental nature of business was sound. Honestly, what else was he to say? At that point, no one knew that the Great Depression would be the longest and most severe economic depression in the nation's history. And he couldn't say that the sky was falling because that would just incite panic. Hoover's response to the Depression was to spend money to shore up banks and businesses. And this was not a terrible strategy. By 1932, 5,000 banks had closed across the nation. There was no FDIC, that was a New Deal creation. So when the banks closed, people lost all they had in those accounts, leading to panic, a loss of trust in banks, and those famous bank runs, where people literally ran to their bank trying to withdraw their funds before it could close. Hoover's thought was that we keep businesses open. so that they could continue to employ people, so that in turn, the unemployment rate would not continue to rise. But despite his efforts, which included the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, providing loans to businesses, stores and financial institutions continued to close their doors, and people who lost their jobs, maybe even their homes, began to feel a kind of desperation, seeking work wherever they could find it. People wanted to find someone to blame, when the reality was there were so many reasons the Depression had begun. No one person was responsible. However, being president means that you are the person at the top of the government in a very public position. As frustrations grew amongst the American population, some began blaming Hoover. One of the biggest criticisms lodged against the president was that he refused to provide direct relief, money directly to the people who had been affected by the economic downturn. To be fair, Hoover did more than any president before him had ever done in any previous depression, signing off on large-scale governmental programs geared towards economic recovery. But he felt that direct relief provided by the federal government went too far. For those homeless individuals, they sardonically began referring to their makeshift shacks as Hoovervilles and their empty, outturned pockets as Hoover flags. At the end of his presidency in 1932, when the unemployment had crept up into the 20% range, homeless World War I veterans decided to camp outside the Capitol, wanting promised bonuses delivered to them earlier than Congress was willing to allocate those funds. They were called the Bonus Army. Hoover, fearing violence, ordered the makeshift homes, the Anacostia Flats, named after the area that they were built in, burned. The pictures show the United States Army forcibly removing those men and their families. The public sympathies were largely with the veterans. 1932 was an election year. In the 1932 presidential election, Hoover ran against the former governor of New York, the very enthusiastic Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt won with a comfortable electoral college margin, and Democrats took majorities in both houses of Congress. When Roosevelt was sworn in March of 1933, the nation was reeling from 25% unemployment, the highest during the Great Depression. Roosevelt promised the nation a sense of hope, and soon after taking office, began pushing Congress to pass his New Deal alphabet agencies, beginning with the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Those agencies targeted the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform, and included the FDIC, the CCC, the CWA, the WPA, the TVA, the FDIC, the NRA, the AAA, the FSA, etc. The list goes on. One major difference between Roosevelt and Hoover's responses to depression is that Roosevelt felt no qualms about direct relief, with both the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, serving as government-funded work programs. The New Deal, while not ending the Depression, had a lasting impact on American politics, economics, and society. Some of those New Deal programs are still around, like the REA, the TVA, the FDIC, and Social Security. But perhaps the biggest political consequence is that Roosevelt forever expanded the office of the executive, signing by far the most executive orders of any president, almost 4,000. Now keep in mind he was president not only during the Great Depression, but also during World War II. I provided you with a brief context of the Depression, but what I've left out is the human toll. How did this moment in American history shape the years after it, even to the present day? What impact did the Depression have on those who experienced it? And how do we see that impact today? I sit with 4 experts ready to discuss just this. Adam Guerrero, there he is, who teaches history. Heather Elliott, who teaches economics. Vanessa Steinkamp, who teaches government. And Janelle Buck, who teaches psychology. So let's begin a deep dive into the Great Depression. All right, so my first question is for Heather. Why did the economy collapse in 1929, and why did it turn into the Great Depression instead of just a short recession?
All right, so a lot of what she talked about was kind of in this answer. So in the 1920s, everybody thought the economy was looking good. Underneath it was very unstable, but the pictures we were seeing didn't really show that. People were buying stock. They were using borrowed money. They assumed that prices were going to keep going up on those stocks. And at the same time, the wealth was very unevenly distributed. It was very much in the hands of the corporations and the big businesses and not in the hands of the people. Americans did not earn enough to keep buying, so businesses were depending on credit and optimism and things like that. If you didn't know, consumption is extremely important to the economy. Consumers spending money is what keeps it running. So when the stock prices fell in 1929, they started panicking. People outright panicked. They started running to their banks. Banks were tied up in the stock market as well. And so they started failing, and it was a domino effect. People started telling their friends, and they started hearing things, and then they started running to their banks, and savings were wiped out. All the money people had was gone, so they were no longer able to pay their rents and mortgages and buy their goods that they needed. Policymakers allowed the collapse. They didn't stop that from happening, and the money supply started shrinking as well. Which caused prices to fall, wages to fall. Even if you still had a job, you were not being paid as much. And so then that slowed spending even more, and it, again, just spirals into a very deep recession. Had there been things in place for the government to step in and to help fix it or slow it down, we might have just had a short recession. But the way that the economics worked back then, the government didn't get involved in any of that. And so the protections that we have now just weren't there then. And so that's what caused it to drag into such a Great Depression.
Thank you. I love a statistic. I always put it up for my students when I talk about the Great Depression. You mentioned wealth inequality. By 1929, 5% of the population held a third of the income, which is crazy, crazy, crazy to think about. It's actually more lopsided today, if you're wondering. So that's an interesting thing, an interesting thing. Thank you, Heather. Vanessa, my next question is for you. So how did the role of the federal government change after the Great Depression?
Prior to the Great Depression, who's ever had something bad happen to them in their lives? Raise your hand. I feel like everybody's hand is raised. Prior to the Great Depression, you would look to yourself, your state, really, if need be, to help you if something bad happened. After the Great Depression, the zeitgeist shifts, and they look to the federal government to start solving these problems that were once solved by the state or yourself. August 14th, 1935, the Social Security Act is passed. It established a permanent system of age benefits, unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, and the disabled. This is really significant for the shift in power towards the federal government, because it is the first time the federal government takes real responsibility for the economic security for the elderly and whom they deem vulnerable. This program was not only established as a permanent system, but it was created in a way that it would also expand and evolve. And the federal government becomes this safety net for people in a way that had never been established prior. And so you really see a shift in power towards the federal government, which will expand during the 50s, 60s, and 70s quite significantly.
Wonderful, thank you. So Adam, you get the next question. You have to give us some historical context here. How did the Great Depression reshape local communities, both in terms of cooperation and conflict? And what kinds of historical evidence help us understand those changes at the ground level?
It didn't. Next question. I'm teasing. There's a lot happening. Yes, it's easy for us to kind of look at graphs and say, okay, here's election results, here's how, say, the stock market, how the value of currency, everything else, but probably more than anything, at least what I love to do is get at the ground level and look at how people are living their lives. For instance, certain things that happen as you see displacement, a lot of migration happening, right? And people are moving not because they just, oh, I want to, go somewhere where the climate's better. No, they're moving because they're forced to. They have no other option, right? It's necessity. One great example of that is farmers, right? So if you look at, as Heather had brought up, and y'all kind of talked about even with income inequality, right? Farmers, you don't go into farming to be rich. That doesn't exist. Farmers do it, we need them more than anything, but you're doing enough to get by, maybe a little profit. But with farmers, this was just the perfect storm, because not only do you have people who are buying on credit, the economy's gone to crap, but you also have a lot of overproduction in farming itself, right? You actually see it affect the topsoil of as they're trying to grow crops. And just as if it just couldn't get any worse, right when the economy collapses, you have the Dust Bowl, right? How many of you, I always show this to students, how many of you have seen Courage the Cowardly Dog? Raise your hand. Yeah, there you are. I see you back there, Professor Lewis. That's based off of one of those farms in the Great Depression. And if you ever look at images from this time period, I mean, you can't grow when you have, so all that topsoil is being drought causing that topsoil to just blow away. So people lose their income. They can't grow on their farms anymore. So a lot of those people had to pick up and leave and go to another location just to try to find some sort of way to survive. And unfortunately, if you're moving to another area and those individuals are struggling, where you're an outsider, I don't want to help you. So there's going to be tensions with those individuals, right? So as we kind of saw, we looked at migrant camps, for instance, and Hoovervilles, people having to move to those, which are not great accommodations by any means. But more so on the ground. So who's leading the charge at first? We learned about wonderful Hoover. And really, it's your churches and other local organizations like the Red Cross, women's clubs, other groups that are providing soup kitchens for people, individuals, because currency was worthless, right? So people went back to some kind of like what you would see in the early days of civilization, a bartering system. Hey, I will give you this product, I'll give you this crop or whatever in exchange for services or whatever it may be, right? So you have various groups of people who are, having to migrate, people having to barter. You also have community bonds are strengthening at this time. So you have a lot of people who you had to look out for your neighbor the best you could, or at least families. Next to kin, everybody trying to help each other out the best that they could. You also see, like, for instance, another group like the Father Divine movement that you see even within certain groups, there's differences. So, for instance, the Father Divine movement, they were a church organization, mostly African-American. And at the same time, as they're just trying to provide relief, just like everybody else, jobs, shelter, food, you also see those individuals being targeted by local communities. Like neighbors would call and say, oh, they're being too loud. Oh, they're having social gatherings past 8 p.m. or whatever, just trying to get them shut down. But, hey, we kind of know the reason for that. So more than anything, you see there's elements of cooperation, and people had to get real crafty in how they supported each other and how they cooperated. But at the same time, you do see a scarcity of resources and people fighting over those things, which definitely will lead to tensions. So in short, it's a hot mess.
Well, it wouldn't be called the Great Depression if it weren't a hot mess, right? Great Depression. All right, my next question is for Janelle. What is the impact of economic uncertainty and hardship on mental health?
Given all, thank you, sorry. Given all the chaos that's happening during the Great Depression, I expected to find kind of a lot of research about the impact of mental health. And in the 30s, we didn't really talk about mental health in the same way or keep records about things like depression and anxiety. So what I had to do is look at research on other times where economics were challenging to see what sort of impact they had. And what we see, whether it's the Great Recession or whether it was the COVID economy, is that there is huge increases in depression and anxiety in particular. Depending on the period of time, it either doubles the amount of cases of depression and anxiety that we see or triples it. So we're going to see a lot of low mood, low feelings, distress happening during times of economic uncertainty. What we do have some numbers about is suicide. So a lot of people often think about suicide when they think about the Great Depression. There was quite a lot of high-profile suicides that happened. And we did see, particularly in urban areas, an uptick in the suicide rate. Particularly early on during the Great Depression when everyone is just finding out about the change of fortune that they have and so forth. It's really going to sort of level out a little bit after that. And just sort of interestingly, even though people had a great concern for suicide at that time, our rates today are much higher than anything that they saw during that time. The other thing that happens around mental health in the time of economic uncertainty is substance abuse. Alcoholism, and in the 30s, morphine addiction was a big issue as well. So it was the prohibition at the beginning of the Great Depression. However, we did see, when you look at medical cases, hospitalization records, things like that, we are seeing still a lot of use of alcohol, binge drinking, drinking to intoxication. So alcohol use was still a big issue. There was a combined problem with that in that the government was actually asking producers of alcohol to add unsafe substances to alcohol, so people would die more frequently because of their alcohol use and things like that. So we saw a lot of issues happen around mental health, but not all of them were as well documented as other things. Since then, we've also learned that when we look at hardship in mental health, any hardship around housing is particularly difficult for mental health. And we saw a lot of people lose their housing, so renters and homes, farms, all of that. And whenever housing comes into question, anxiety in particular goes sort of sky high, and we're going to see a lot of generalized anxiety and other anxiety issues.
All right, thank you. Adam, you're up next. So how do historians reconstruct the day-to-day lives of ordinary Americans during the Great Depression? And what do those personal accounts reveal that broader national narratives often miss?
This is how we do our job. This is the stuff that I love, right? So it's, for instance, as Professor Reed talked about, 25% of the nation was without any sort of income, any means of taking care of themselves. But what does that actually mean, right? We can show graphs, we can show, numbers, but on the ground level, what does that mean for survival? Now, this is the thing that as historians, we love very much. For instance, we're, sifting through letters and journal entries, but more so than anything, like oral histories. One of my favorite things growing up was talking to my grandfather and great-grandfather about life during the Great Depression. My great-grandfather was actually born the same day as the Titanic sank, and my grandfather was born October 2nd, 1929. So he was a baby and grew up during much of that time period, and just asking them about their lives. Now, of course, oral historians are not coming and talking to my grandfather immediately. But one of the things, for instance, the Works Progress Administrations, it was one of those three-letter words or acronyms that Professor Reed spouted off earlier. I'm sure y'all caught it. But the Works Progress Administration, they conducted interviews. So they hired people, writers, journalists, researchers, just go around and ask people about their lives, talk to people, get information about them. And they wanted to know about, tell us about what kind of job you had before, or tell us how this is hitting you of trying to find a job. Describe the hunger issues, right? A lot of those things like, what are you eating? How are you finding food? And ultimate survival strategies, which I feel like that was one of my favorite things to ask about. What did you eat? How did you survive? Because most of us are so comfortable nowadays, we don't ever worry about when's the next meal coming, right? And so they use, and it's not just through letters, but we also have images like this one right here. Dorothy Lang is a very powerful image, the migrant mother, right? This was in 1936. This is Florence Owens Thompson, and she is a mother in a migrant camp. And immediately your eyes are drawn to her face. Now, if you notice, she's got, actually, and they kind of cut it off here, there's 2 children, and then she also has a baby with her. And it almost just, these questions come up. What is she thinking? I'm a father. I can't even imagine what that is like, thinking, where's the next meal coming from? How am I going to take care of these kids? Even while I'm sitting up here, I'm literally thinking about my children. Are they okay? Where are they at? It's always running in the back of your mind. Do you mind clicking over to the next image? We also see images like this. This is Lucille Chalifot. She is, as you can tell, a mother who is, out of desperation, having to sell her 4 children. Now, she's obviously hiding her face out of shame, right? But this is something that you don't normally see in society, right? And so it really, it asks the question, how bad are things that somebody is going to this extent just to survive? Or maybe she can't provide. I'm going to have to give this over to you, or give these children over to you so they have a chance. You also have men just abandoning their families because they're so upset that they can't take care of their family anymore. They're not the breadwinner, compounding the issues that women are already facing. So again, the biggest thing to know about this is that, and I always try to tell this to students, numbers and graphs, those are real people, right? When we get down to the ground level, when we ask these stories, or we try to document these things, especially the oral histories, very much helps us understand the daily life and what these individuals were experiencing.
All right, thank you. That's a great point. I mean, even just looking at statistics, as you start breaking it down, it gets tricky. Like the unemployment statistic only counts people who are actively seeking work and can't find it. So 25% unemployment is actually worse. And if you look at different groups, it can be worse. 25% unemployment was for the nation. Black men and women had 50% unemployment during the Great Depression. So even statistics, looking at statistics and breaking them down in different ways, gives you a bigger picture of how different people are affected. All right, so my next question, back to economics, is for Heather. What were the most important economic effects of the Great Depression on everyday Americans and businesses?
Well, the biggest one everybody's been talking about is the unemployment. Unemployment was at 25% nationwide. A great point was just made that does not include people who were not looking for work. So all of those people, we have this discussion in class a lot, really, if they want to work but they've given up, they're not counted anymore. And so they should be. So the problem is always worse than what it looks like. When we look at 25% employment, I always tell people, if you're sitting in a group of 4, at least one of you does not have a job. And the rest may or may not have a job at that point. People who were employed also were not being employed full-time. They were having their hours cut. They were having their pay cut. They were in situations where they may still have their job, but that job's not paying the bills anymore. we talked about prices falling. Prices falling is usually seen as a good thing. We like to see prices go down, but they were also seeing their incomes fall, and their incomes fell faster than the prices. And so even though things were becoming cheaper, they still could not afford them because their incomes were now less than they were before. So basic needs were hard, repaying the debts were hard. We got into the problem by everybody speculating and borrowing money, and so now they can't repay those debts either, and those loans have all been called in for the banks to continue to try to operate. Businesses were struggling, consumers aren't spending any money, so companies are closing. We talked about the farms failing. Once those companies close, then those people lose their jobs. And so again, it all spirals. It all is that domino effect. Banks stopped lending money because they didn't want to take the risk at this point because there was no insurance to bail them out if something happened. The Federal Reserve had been created in 1913, so it was already in effect, but it didn't really have any power to help bail out banks yet. And so it was still trying to get off the ground. Once the FDIC got created, that helped out a lot. But that hardship changed views. I mean, people, even today, you see banks they don't lend as freely as they used to. People, especially the older grandparents, my grandfather was a teenager in the Great Depression. And so he was always very frugal with everything he did. He always used everything. There was never anything that went to waste. I mean, it lasts through the generations. And those lessons don't get forgotten by those people. So.
All right. Thank you. Vanessa, we've kind of been touching upon this a little bit. So when the Great Depression hits, we have a couple of different reactions to it, at least politically. But both of those reactions have an impact on how the government is going to forever and always look at economic downturns. So could you tell us, how did federalism change because of the Great Depression?
So federalism is the sharing of powers between the state and the central government, where they have some sovereign powers, where they have autonomy, and they have some overlapping shared powers, which are concurrent powers. And I think Heather just touched upon something. Every generation has an event that they say is the generation's watershed moment, which forever changes their generation. What do you guys think my generation's watershed event was? Please don't say like Vietnam or something. What do you guys think it was? Say it louder. 9/11, right? Your generation, what is your generation's generational event? What was the big event that changed your life? COVID, right? So that generational event was the Great Depression, and it changed the whole balance of power between the states and the feds. After you have the Great Depression, you see the federal government expanding power over the states via mandates. Mandates are federal laws that the states must comply with. You see a growth of funded and even unfunded mandates that states must follow. You see a series of categorical grants. Categorical grants are money, federal money to the states that the states must spend based on how the federal government stipulates. You also see a bevy of condition of aid. So the whole balance of power is shifting from the states to the feds. So the state government is shrinking as a result. And it's going to usher in, prior to the Great Depression, we called the era before dual federalism, where both of those entities had co-equal power. If you've taken a dual credit class, you know that you get high school and college credit, and it is even possible for you to pass the class in college but fail it in high school because there are different thresholds for passing. Once you shift from dual, you move into what political scientists will call it cooperative, coercive, and fiscal federalism, where the federal government really is retaining a lot more power. If you have a Venn diagram that you drew during dual federalism, they would almost be co-equal. And by the time you get to cooperative, you see the federal government expanding quite a bit, and even that concurrent area expanding a lot, which really signals the federal government is shifting in power quite significantly.
All right, thank you. Janelle, back to you. So what was the silent generations, that's the name of that generation, what was the silent generation's perspective on struggling with mental health, and how did the Great Depression influence children? growing up during that time?
Right, so as I was looking through this and researching and preparing, one of the things that really struck me was the amount of shame that people felt, which is going to connect back to those feelings of depression and anxiety. Unlike other times, during the Great Depression, a lot of people felt personally responsible for not being able to provide for their children, provide for their families. And because of this shame, very little help was sought for any struggles that they might have had with mental health. Their generation is known for being very skeptical about struggles with mental health and receiving help for it. And even if they were interested, access to mental health care was not always easily available. They're also known for sort of having the view that you just have to sort of tough things out, right? They're called the silent generation because they just sort of would just get on with it. And because of that, we often missed the struggles that they've had. I've also heard them called the wounded generation because not only did they live through the Great Depression, also World War II is upcoming, right? So, and with World War II comes its own sets of traumas and issues. And so we're going to see a lot of people really not discuss mental health and not seek help when they need it. This is going to have an impact on kids. There's a lot of stuff happening for children at this time. I'm a developmental psychologist, so this is what I really am interested in. And for children, they are going to learn a lot of lessons about being frugal and independence. As Adam discussed, there was a lot of abandonment, so women and children would sort of have to fend for themselves. This meant children worked very early. If there was a job available, they would do any work that was available to them. However, jobs were scarce for part-time work and children's work at the time. And so one interesting effect was more kids actually spent a little more time in school. So because they couldn't work, so they might as well go to school at that time. My grandparents, all of them, would be of this generation. And my grandmother would tell me that she was from Texarkana and she was the youngest of 11. So there was not a lot to go around. And one of her school teachers would take her home at lunch so that she could feed her lunch, otherwise she wouldn't eat, right? So these are sort of the lessons that are coming in from this time. And really, mental health was something that was primarily going to be ignored by this generation, not always to their benefit.
All right, that's good information. Vanessa, back to you. So we've been talking about changes that we're seeing at a social level, a governmental level, an economic level. So could you tell us just about a couple of those federal programs passed because of the Great Depression?
I'm actually going to do 3. I'm going to exceed the question. We already talked about the Social Security Act of 1935, but it is expanded later on to include disability coverage and Medicare. So you see the Social Security Act not only is established for some qualified groups, but it will expand those groups to provide services. You also see another WPA program, not the Works Progress Program, but the Works Program Administration created, which will provide jobs to unemployed, to build schools, hospitals, roles, and this will make, at the time, the federal government the largest employer. So you're going to see a shift even to the federal government for jobs to help with services. And you guys have already mentioned a couple of times, so I guess this is a little repetitive, but the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, is created in 1933, which is created to help restore trust in the banking system, because you need people to want to put money in banks to have, you know, the economy thrive. And they're also going to insure deposits, which is going to provide a level of support for people to be willing to put their money in there. Like I remember in 2009, I actually had this happen during the Great Recession. One of the banks that I had my money in, Chorus Bank in Chicago, actually went under. But it was FDIC insured, and we got an email the next morning that said, don't worry, your money is safe. blah, blah, blah. So even in 2009, that program created in 1933 to help create stability and kind of a trust in the system was established.
Awesome. We're very glad you didn't lose your deposits. Yeah. All right, Heather, back to you. What long-term lessons did policymakers take from the Great Depression, and why do they still matter today?
Well, the big lesson was that we needed to secure the financial system. Again, we had the Federal Reserve Bank. It was acting as a central bank, but it didn't have as much power. It was still kind of figuring it all out when all this happened. But there was nothing in place when the Great Depression happened to protect your deposits or anything like that, which is what caused the panics and the runs. So the FDIC was created. That even today helps out, like we just heard, obviously. But the Federal Reserve also monitors all of the banks that are part of the system. They are stepping in if there's something that happens. They help them get loans if they need it whenever they're struggling or they need an overnight loan or something like that. Today, we even saw, well, not today, but a few years ago, we saw Silicon Valley Bank that failed, and the Federal Reserve stepped in and took over that bank immediately as soon as it happened. The Treasury Department stepped in and helped them out to make sure that the people got their money back because there was lots of millionaires there and they didn't have enough backing from the FDIC. But those kinds of things, we have put those safeguards in place now. All of the federal safety programs, safety net programs, and all that stuff have taken place as well. We saw a major shift in economic policy during that time with shifting from we stay out of it, we don't want to get involved, to now we're going to actively get involved in these situations to try to make them a little less painful, not get as bad as they are, or as this one did, to avoid having this happen again.
I love that you mentioned a couple of years ago the Silicon Valley Bank, because that was such a big deal. People were like, oh, what's going to happen? And then it just ceased being news because it got taken care of. So yeah, that's a great example. All right, Adam, back to you. Back for a little bit more history. How has the memory of the Great Depression through stories, photographs, and cultural narratives shaped our understanding of the period? And how do historians work to separate myth from historical reality?
That's the joy of podcasts nowadays, when historians can jump in and say, well, actually, that movie was incorrect in this way. So again, that's the beauty. That is what history is, right? It's our collective memory and how we understand the past, right? There's a difference between the past and the events that took place, and then history is the lens by which we look at those things in the past, make sense of them, see patterns, that sort of thing. So when, say, for instance, written during this time, like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, right? Those are, I mean, now, of course, it's very much on the banned books list today, but it's definitely, it's one of those that, yes, it's a fictional story, but it was something that was compiled that Steinbeck actually went through and interviewed migrants and kind of got stories from them about their migration, what happened to them, how they were exploited oftentimes. And so very much it creates fictional characters, but there's those little nuggets of truth in there that definitely people from the time period could absolutely relate to. You see the narrative of like, yes, we're all in this together, right? It was a collective. The country, most everybody was suffering. Now, there were some who were suffering more than others, but it definitely was something that, as far as how the government was portraying it, it's like, hey, I think of FDR's fireside chats like, you know, the only thing to fear is fear itself, right? We're going to get through this. But the biggest thing is really looking at, for a historian, us being able to go in and shed light on the experiences of these individuals. Like this right here, you know, a photograph like this deserves explanation. Us being able to go in and really, if say none of this existed and, you know, a civilization thousands of years from now found that, being able to explain what happened. How did this woman, this mother, come to this moment where she is selling her children, right? Now, I'm sure some of us have gotten annoyed enough and thought, hey, it'd be nice to... But like for instance, even going back, do you mind clicking back for just a moment? So our migrant mother, right? So Florence Owens Thompson, right? Most of you have seen this image probably. I mean, if not here, then in high school. This is a very popular image. But what's interesting is that even though this very much encapsulates what people were experiencing, you actually talk to her further, and whenever they actually asked this, she said this didn't really improve her life at all. This image didn't help her in any way, right? As people probably assumed, oh, now that this attention's going on this poor mother, hopefully she got the relief she needed. No. And so it really kind of shows that, exposure doesn't necessarily lead to relief, right? But also looking at, of course, it's a very popular theme that people like to incorporate in movies nowadays, like, was it Lawless? How many of you have heard of Bonnie and Clyde? Yeah, I would imagine most of you have heard of Bonnie and Clyde. And their story is highly romanticized, even at the time, from local reporters and everybody else, because who doesn't love a couple in love on a killing spree, right? It sells headlines. But there's things that were attached to that story. For instance, people don't talk about the hardships that they endured trying to grow up, the incarceration for theft, the traumas that Clyde Barrow went through while incarcerated. People don't look at, okay, well, yeah, they're in love and they got gunned down, but what about the police officers that were murdered? The stories behind, how vicious this was, right? And even looking at those particular stories, like I think about the 2 officers that were killed in Grapevine. There's, you even have to kind of tease out some stories because eyewitnesses tried to say, well, yeah, you could hear the woman, Bonnie, saying, oh, look how his head bounces off the ground as she's like shooting the officer. But he's the only one that saw that. Other witnesses said no. So then we also have to kind of tease out, is this somebody just trying to, they're bored and they're trying to capture headlines and become famous themselves? Where's the truth at, right? So the biggest thing is that, we look at, our job as historians is to try to look at the specific events that took place and to try to convey to you as best we can how these individuals live their lives. Make sense of, not just how the economy crashed, what the government did, look at the impacts it has on future generations, but really just helping you understand and maybe see some commonalities. So that way, as we kind of talked about, there's been a few economic crises that's happened lately. How would we respond to such things? So,
Great point. I always thought it was interesting because I think all of us here had a relative who grew up during the Depression. And I was born several generations later, wasn't even on my radar, right? But I was connected to the Depression through the stories of my relatives. And that helped to shape my historical understanding of things. So it's interesting that we all, at least those of us who had individuals related to us grow up during the Depression, how we all have those stories that are now part of our understanding of history that we can pass on. So history works in interesting ways. So. All right, Janelle, how were the psychological and that's a hard word, psychological and behavioral effects of the Great Depression passed from one generation to the next? Perfect segue.
I know, you did very well. Well, this is a really big question. It's interesting for us today as it is in the past. For those of us who have relatives that we were able to talk to and interact with from the Great Depression, they had some characteristics that stood out. They were very careful, very frugal. I remember one of my great aunts, if she used aluminum foil, she'd wipe it off and use it again. They would reuse plastic bags. They would wipe them out and reuse them. Also, they had been through quite a lot, as I mentioned before, in their lifetime from the Great Depression to World War II. So they did have a healthy level of distrust for banks, sometimes the government, things like that. And so we noticed that some of these behaviors and some of these challenges in mental health were passed from one generation to the next. And the question was how. And we're still working on the question. I'll sort of give you a sense of where we are. The first one is through parenting, so sort of direct instruction. We tell kids in particular sort of who they should be suspicious of, whether they should question certain things. And when really we have some parents who give a lot of survival and avoidance-based advice. So like, be really careful, you can't trust this, don't do this. And that does lead to children being slightly fearful. So you're gonna see some of the continuation of that through just our basic messages. We essentially, sometimes when we have experienced a trauma, whether it's the Great Depression or something else, we create sort of a shared environment of stress, right? We are stressed. We're going to create a shared environment of stress, which is going to lead to some psychological and behavioral challenges. We also can look at the field of epigenetics. So epigenetics has to do with our DNA, and our experiences do change us at sort of a fundamental level. So epigenetics are large proteins that actually sit on top of our genetic code, and they're very important, and they tell us, like, they tell our body what parts of the genetic code to read and what parts to ignore. So you can think of it very generally as sort of turning certain genes on and off. And we find that, especially people who experienced a trauma in childhood, it's going to actually affect their genetic code and what genes will be read versus not. And this is how we're going to see it transmitted from one generation to the next. We also see, on that sort of same note, chemical alterations in our genes when we experience traumatic events that we can actually pass on. So it is kind of wild what I'm saying. I'm saying that when someone is a child, if they've had a very traumatic experience, long before they're even thinking about having children, they can pass on some of that experience to their children.
That's
So
really
the reason why we treat y'all the way we do in class is we're engaging in the epigenetics to see how we can change your genetic coding. That's why we do what we do.
Because we have them for so long a time, right? I love that you mentioned that. I had this moment just last week when I was helping my son clean up his room. I was cleaning up the room. And he had like 15 Dr. Pepper cans, something ridiculous. And I was lecturing him, saying, this is so wasteful. Like, you've got to at least finish. If you take a drink, you've got to finish it. And I had this flash moment in my mind back in my childhood when I would go to my grandmother's house and I would leave a half-empty Dr. Pepper can, and she would give me the same lecture. How wasteful. And it was just so weird. It was like, oh my gosh, Nana. Ah! So it's interesting to trace those generational lessons that come down. And obviously, it's biological, right?
Somewhat.
Yes, somewhat biological. Love it. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up and let you ask questions of us. So Heather, the next question is for you. How did the Great Depression change economic policy and the role of government in the economy?
Well, prior to the Great Depression, we were operating under something called classical economics, which had been the theory that had been in place ever since the United States became the United States, which was very hands-off. They did not want the government involved in anything besides making some laws and enforcing them. And that made a lot of sense. I mean, we had just come from being under a king in a country that was trying to control us, and so they didn't want that government involvement. And so once we got to the Great Depression, we had been in a situation where we just kind of let the economy do its thing. I mean, it was kind of trying to correct itself. It would naturally move back towards where it needed to be. But then we got stuck. We got in a situation that wasn't happening anymore. And so there was an economist who was writing overseas. He was British, and his name was Keynes. And he was, using it as a case study, basically. He was watching the Great Depression, and he was saying, here's what you need to do. Everything you're doing is wrong. Here's what you need to do to fix it. And he came up with all of his theories about the government needs to be involved. They need to be taking a role to try to help get you out of these recessionary periods. You need to have the government helping spend money. You need to use taxes. You need to use interest rates. You need to use all of those things. And that was a drastic change in our economic policy. Today, we are kind of, there's both sides of the coin. People like to do both. We kind of mix the best parts of both together in the United States, but that hands-off approach is no longer there. We figured out that we needed the government to at least help out some, and the role of government did grow significantly at that point. It just kind of changed the way we think about everything, banking, government policy, just unemployment, having benefits, having the security net that everybody argues about whether we need it or not. I mean, that's all there because of this, and it's all there because we figured out what happened when we didn't have it. And so it's just that shift in thinking and that we are still seeing today.
All right, thank you. And last question goes to Adam. So to what extent can we talk about a shared American experience during the Great Depression, and where do historians see important differences in how people experienced the crisis depending on their social, economic, and geographic contexts?
Oh, we can talk about it all day, but I'll keep it short. What I always try to tell students even, and anybody who happens to listen to me, yes, there is some commonality, but you cannot paint a wide brushstroke and say everybody's experiences were the same. So for instance, yes, there is a shared hardship that everybody, I mean, it's a global depression, right? Even those of you like, for instance, yes, the United States experienced it in one way, but Germany is another topic, right? Germany experienced some really tough hardships, and that's how fascism came about. But you also have to understand that, yes, there are some who it impacted them harshly, but some were also kind of relatively stable during this, so some families were a little better off. There's also different groups. So if you were a Wall Street executive, yes, you lost quite a bit and you suffered. And you have a similar experience to, say, those farmers that suffered under the Dust Bowl. But also, if you talk to a lot of impoverished individuals, this is actually a joke that we were talking about in the history department. Farmers were like, there's a depression? What? Like, they've always lived that impoverished life anyways, so it's just no different to them. Now, you may see something like your middle-class families, for instance, might have lost their savings, as we talked about with the bank runs, but then there are others who they didn't have the luxury of saving. So whenever they were hit hard, and it is a life or death situation, right? You also see in various other communities, like, people who say, for instance, like the Latino community, right? A lot of Mexicans were repatriated, right? They were deported during this time because even though they had historically worked many of those agricultural jobs, well, now those are jobs that Americans are seeking, and so now they're being forcefully removed from the country. African Americans tend to have found themselves to be the last to be hired and the first to be fired, depending on the region where they were at. Women, as we just got done talking about, yes, men and depression and the approach, why they're sad, oh, we're supposed to be the breadwinners, but then they leave and abandon their families, and then you see women struggling in a very different way. Women oftentimes were targeted because, those are jobs that are supposed to be for men who need to take care of their families, and they're like, well, what do you think I'm doing? But okay. So again, yes, it is a national thing, but understanding that there are groups within the group, right? It's not uniform, and that's where it's interesting as a historian. We can go in and actually tease out this information, or you don't even have to be a historian. Those of you who might have family members who were alive during that time, or even talking to those who were the children of the silent generation. There's so much that you can learn, guys. Go talk to the older generation. Go ask them questions. I promise you'll never be let down.
That's a great segue because I'm about to have them ask you questions. All right, so we are done here with our panel, but if any of you have questions, we would love to hear from you. So I'm going to bring the mic down. Any questions? Oh, okay. Down from the stage. There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The FDIC, what was the dollar figure that they insured? Do you know that by any chance when they first started?
Do you know? I know what it is now.
Yeah,
I
I
do
don't know how
too.
it changed after the recession, but I'm not the historian.
Yeah,
so
I
know
don't, I don't know what it was originally. I know it's 250,000 now per account.
It
Right,
went up
right.
100,000
Yeah.
after the Great Recession. Do you?
Yeah.
I can
just-
Google it.
I'm just curious what it started at. And the mental health, do you have a quick reference that we could go back and read some more about what you've been talking about?
I have quite a few.
Maybe after this, I could
Yes.
talk to you for a minute.
Or, absolutely. And I can give you my email because I had to use quite a few things because there wasn't really just sort of an aggregated space for it like you might have. Even at one point, I just Googled something like generations and mental health perspectives. And they don't even include the silent generation or the greatest generation in that research. So I had to do a little bit of deeper digging, and I'm happy to share all the stuff I looked at or that I kept with me, with you.
Just a point real quick to the history. My parents grew up during the Depression. My grandparents were, my grandfather was a blacksmith and tenant farmer in East Texas. And they always said, though it hurt them a lot less than the city folks because they grew their own food and their own chickens and things of this nature. So it affected people a great deal different, depending on where you lived.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because especially a lot of those folks that are out in the rural communities, they already had to be rather resilient in how the items that they had available to them, how they survived. But city folk, you are very much, and that's even true today, you're very dependent upon the services that are available to you, and those things are funded by our economy. It just kind of, what would happen if DoorDash disappeared all of a sudden? I tell you, it would be terrifying, right? A whole generation just crippled. Look at y'all. I just saw eyes get big. They're like, oh no, DoorDash is going away. What?
I did Google it for you. Sure. So originally, when it was passed in 1933, it was $2,500 per depositor. They do increase it July 1st to $5,000 to increase people putting money in banks and kind of to spur more kind of energy within the banking system.
You brought up your thing in Chicago.
Yeah.
When Texas had the savings and loan debacle, we had some large CDs at a savings and loan that were reduced to almost nothing, but another bank bought them through FDIC. So it can come back and help the average investor.
Which is nice, right? There's a layer of protection there that makes people feel better than about not putting their money in their mattress, so to speak, but putting it in a bank where you can even maybe make some money off of them borrowing your money.
I remember when my grandfather passed away, and that was, oh gosh, 99. We were cleaning up and found, still 99, found money that he had stuffed in his socks.
My grandfather put money in his, my grandfather's tucked it in books.
Yes.
Yeah, in his little art studio, he had books on the shelves, and my mom was like, make sure you shake out all those books. And I'm like, what? And he's like, yeah, he's got $100 bills stuffed in there.
Oh, yeah, they stuffed money everywhere. They did not spend money. I mean, people did not throw away things, the clothing. I think about my grandfather. That man, we would buy him new pajamas every year, and he would not wear them. He would wear the same tattered things, and the waistband is falling off, the ring around the where the sleeve was, but everything else was ripped up to here. He's like, oh, no, it's fine. And I remember after he passed, we went through his closet, and for some reason he had behind all his clothes just a stack on the wall of cans of pork and beans and potted meat. And it's like, who on earth is going to steal that from you? But that was that mentality.
Yeah. All right, any other questions?
I was just wondering because I watched a show called The Waltons. You can Google what it's about, but I was just wondering how accurate it is.
Good question. Thank you. No one's watched The Waltons? I have, it's been a long time, but I actually have watched The Waltons.
Yeah, I personally didn't watch the Waltons, but I'll leave that one to Professor Reed. Did you watch the Waltons at all?
I mean, gosh, it's been a while. Did
Yeah,
y'all?
probably.
Michelle, did you? Yeah. I can't speak to the historical accuracy of that particular show. What I would say, just kind of in general, is that any kind of Hollywood production likes to take artistic liberties. So always kind of go into it, watching it, and thinking, okay, well, they're throwing some history stuff out. I better check this. So definitely double check everything you see in movies and TV shows. Yeah, but it was a good show, as far as I remember. Yeah. All right, any other questions? That was my favorite part. All right. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. This is the last event, but I will give you a preview of fall 2026 if you're going to be around in fall 2026. Our theme for that semester is all about space. So the history of space and space exploration. So lots to delve into in fall 2026. And I'll get that information out as soon as I have it. You'll see flyers around the campus. All right, thanks again for coming. Thanks again. Oh, yes, and if you would, please, there is a sheet of paper on your table that says evaluation. If you will click that QR code and leave us an evaluation, we do read them. We do like to get those evaluations. So please take the time to fill that out and have a wonderful rest of your day.